Tonight, the topic we explore is the extraordinary life of Joan of Arc, the young French heroine whose courage, faith, and leadership inspired a nation in the midst of war. From peasant girl to military commander, her divine visions propelled her to the forefront of history, where she led armies and crowned a king. Her legacy continues to shine through centuries of war, faith, and resistance. Joan's martyrdom and canonization reflect a powerful story of conviction and strength. So before you get comfortable, as always, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, only if you enjoy our content. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Sometimes our stories are so interesting, we get caught up, and other times, we work through some slower ones. It's time now to dim the lights, turn on a fan for some background noise, and let's dive into the incredible journey of Joan of Arc together. Before she became a warrior, a symbol, and a saint, Joan of Arc was just a child in a quiet corner of the world. A place so small, most maps didn't even bother marking it. The village was called Domremy. Nestled in the gentle valleys of northeastern France, Domremy was the kind of place where time moved slowly. Rolling hills stretched beyond the horizon, dotted with sheep and thatched roof cottages. The seasons shaped daily life. In spring, the rivers sang with melted snow. In summer, fields of barley swayed like golden oceans. In winter, snow blanketed the earth in silence. It was in this peaceful setting that Jeanne, or Joan as we know her today, was born sometime around 1412. Her parents, Jacques and Isabelle d'Arc, were simple farmers. They didn't have wealth, but they had land, faith, and 5 children. Joan was the youngest. From a young age, Joan was different. She wasn't loud. She wasn't wild. She prayed more than she played. People in the village noticed that this girl, barely out of childhood, would slip quietly into the church and kneel in silence for hours. Her eyes would close, and her lips would move in gentle whispers only God could hear. The France Joan was born into was deeply broken. The 100 Years' War had dragged on for generations. Towns had been burned, crops had been stolen. Fathers had not returned from battlefields. England occupied much of northern France, and the rightful heir to the French throne, the Dauphin, Charles, had not been crowned. His claim was disputed, his power limited. But Joan didn't know any of that yet. In Domremy, her world was small. Her days were filled with chores, spinning wool, fetching water, helping her mother bake bread. She didn't go to school, but she learned the rhythms of nature, the voices of the seasons, and the songs of the saints. She listened, and perhaps something listened back. No one in Domremy could have guessed what destiny had planned for this quiet girl with rough hands and a reverent heart. But in time, Joan would leave that sleepy village, and the entire world would remember her name. Domremy was where she began, but it would not be where she stayed. While Joan's world was small and quiet, the world beyond her village was loud with chaos. France was not whole. For decades, the land had been torn apart by a conflict known as the 100 Years' War, a struggle between England and France, not over a single battle or border, but over the very right to rule the Kingdom of France itself. The roots of the war stretched back to 1337, nearly 75 years before Joan was even born. English kings claimed they had a right to the French crown. French nobles rejected that claim. What followed was a long, bitter war that twisted the land and drained its people. By the time Joan was a child, entire regions of northern France were under English control. The once mighty Kingdom of France had been split, not just by foreign armies but by civil war. French factions fought each other, while the English took more ground. Allies became traitors. Cities changed hands. And everywhere, the people suffered. The worst part? The man who was supposed to become king, Charles VII, the Dauphin, had not yet been crowned. His father had died, but no official coronation had taken place. His enemies used that fact to deny his legitimacy. The English called him the so-called king. Even some of his own countrymen doubted him, And then there was Orléans, a city that stood like a final barrier between the English army and the heart of France. If Orléans fell, the English would likely march straight into the Loire Valley, and from there, perhaps all of France would be theirs. By the time Joan was a teenager, Orléans was under siege. The French had lost so much. Their troops were tired, their leaders divided, their king uncrowned and uncertain. It's hard to imagine, but that was the world young Joan would soon walk into. A world of swords and banners, of smoke and fire, a world where entire cities vanished overnight. A world waiting for a miracle. And somewhere, in the hills of Domremy, a teenage girl, unknown, unarmed and unheard, believed she had been chosen to be that miracle. She wasn't a knight. She wasn't royalty. But in a country at war, sometimes the quietest voice becomes the one the world needs most. Before the voices, before the battles, before history etched her name into the stones of cathedrals and the pages of books, Joan lived simply. Her home in Domremy was small but strong, built from timber and stone, nestled near the river Meuse. The Dark family was not rich, but they had enough. Her father, Jacques, was a respected farmer and village official, serious perhaps, but steady. Her mother, Isabel, was warm and deeply religious. Joan likely learned both her grit and her faith from them. Daily life was predictable. The rooster's call marked the start of the morning. Joan would rise early, help her mother knead bread or tend the animals. She learned how to sew and spin, like most girls did. She learned how to listen, which few ever mastered. Education in Domremy was rare. Joan couldn't read or write, but that didn't mean she wasn't intelligent. She listened to scripture during Mass. She memorized prayers. She absorbed stories told by priests. Tales of saints who had fought dragons, cast out demons, and stood strong in the face of kings. Joan loved to pray. She often visited the church of St. Remigius, just a short walk from her home. She would kneel in stillness for long stretches, her eyes closed, her lips moving silently. Others noticed her devotion. They would say, "That girl is different." But they said it gently, not with fear, with awe. In the village, there were whispers of distant battles, of lands captured and kings betrayed. But for the most part, Domremy was peaceful, at least for a time. The war was always close, but not quite on their doorstep. Still, it left its shadow. Some nights, soldiers passed through. They took grain. Sometimes they took worse. And sometimes, Joan saw flames in the distance, a reminder that peace was fragile, and the world beyond the hills was never truly still. Yet, in those early years, Joan's life was filled with quiet duties, sacred rituals, and the rhythm of the earth. She had no sword, no title, no army, just a heart full of faith and a strange, growing feeling that she was meant for something more, something far beyond the fields of Domremy. It began quietly, soft as a breath, gentle as a summer wind passing through tall grass. Joan was 13 when she first heard them, the voices. She was alone in her father's garden, or perhaps walking in the fields beyond Domremy. The accounts vary, but what remains clear is how certain she was of what she experienced. A sudden light, a warmth, a voice that wasn't hers, but felt familiar, not frightening, not strange, but peaceful and powerful. At first, Joan told no one. She wasn't sure if anyone would believe her. She barely believed it herself. But the voices came again and again. They didn't speak like ordinary people. They didn't command in harsh tones. They guided. And in time, Joan saw them clearly, radiant figures standing before her in silence, and then speaking with solemn grace. She said they were St. Michael the Archangel, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret, holy figures of strength, purity, and courage. To Joan, they weren't just names from church windows or Sunday sermons. They were real. They walked with her, and they brought a message. They told her that God had chosen her, that she had a divine mission to drive the English out of France, to restore her homeland, to lead an army, and to crown the rightful king. Imagine hearing such a thing at 13, when you've never held a weapon, never left your village, never even spoken to a nobleman. But Joan believed, not because she wanted glory, not because she sought attention, but because the calling felt true. At first, the saints told her to be patient. The time would come, but not yet. She was to remain faithful, pure, and steady. And she did. For years she waited, praying, listening, preparing her heart. To others, Joan seemed the same, just a quiet, devout girl in a war-torn land. But inside, a fire had been lit. She knew the day would come when she would have to leave her family, her village, everything she had ever known. Because when heaven speaks, you don't ignore the call. You rise. You follow. Even if the world doesn't yet know your name. As the years passed, the voices grew stronger. Joan never doubted them. She didn't question if they were real. To her, they were as present as the wind that stirred the fields outside Domremy, unseen, but unmistakably there. They didn't just speak once and vanish. They returned often, always clear, always patient. She could feel when they were near. Sometimes there was a glow, other times a silence that wrapped around her like a cloak. Saint Michael the Archangel came first, the warrior of heaven, protector of the faithful. His voice was calm but firm, like a commander who knew the path ahead, even if Joan didn't. He was followed by St. Catherine of Alexandria, known for her wisdom and eloquence, and St. Margaret of Antioch, the martyr who stood firm even when the world turned cruel. Together, they became her guides. They told her that France was suffering not just from war, but from despair, that the English occupation was more than a political matter. It was a spiritual crisis. The land had lost its soul, the people had lost their faith. And Joan, this peasant girl in a forgotten village, was to be the light that would lead them back. They told her that she would wear armour, that she would raise a banner in the name of God, that she would lead the Dauphin, the uncrowned prince, to his rightful place at Reims. They didn't promise her safety. They never said it would be easy. They only said it was her path. At first, Joan tried to keep it all to herself. Who would believe her? A girl hearing saints? A girl meant to fight a war? But the voices didn't go away. They grew firmer, more insistent. And eventually, Joan understood. It was time to act. She was no longer just a girl in Domremy. She was a messenger, a servant, and soon, a soldier. The saints in her ear weren't sending her toward comfort. They were sending her into fire, and she was ready to walk through it. Because when the divine calls you by name, you answer. Joan didn't dream small. She didn't see herself as just a helper or a voice from the crowd. Her visions weren't vague feelings or quiet wishes. They were clear, purposeful, burning with certainty. She saw herself riding into battle, not in fear, but in faith. She saw cities freed. She saw the French army, once fractured and hopeless, rallying behind her. She saw the Dauphin, Charles, crowned in the grand cathedral of Reims, just as tradition demanded, just as heaven desired. These weren't fantasies. To Joan, they were glimpses of a future that had already been written, and she had simply been chosen to carry it out. But she also saw resistance. She knew there would be danger. Her voices never promised her comfort, only conviction. They told her she would face doubt. That men, especially powerful men, would question her, mock her, try to silence her. But none of that frightened her. What frightened her was doing nothing. The longer she waited, the heavier the visions became. It was as if they pressed on her chest, urged her forward, reminded her, gently but firmly, that she had been called to act, not later, but now. She tried, at first, to speak to people in Domremy. Some listened kindly. Others nodded but didn't take her seriously. A girl talking about leading armies? It sounded more like a tale from the pulpit than a plan from a teenage farm girl. But Joan kept speaking. The urgency wouldn't let her stay quiet. She knew that France was hanging by a thread. The English siege of Orléans had dragged on for months. If that city fell, the path to the heart of France would be wide open. The Dauphin would be cornered. The dream of a free and united France could vanish completely. And so, Joan's visions pointed her there, to Orléans, to the place where hope was flickering like a candle in the wind. It wasn't just about strategy or land, it was about faith. Faith in a voice, faith in a mission, faith in something bigger than fear. Joan had never been to a battlefield. She had never given a command. But in her heart, she already saw the victory. Now, she just had to go make it real. Joan knew she couldn't fulfill her mission alone. She needed to reach the Dauphin, Charles, the rightful heir. She needed to look him in the eye and tell him what heaven had told her, that he was meant to be king, and that she was meant to lead him there. But Charles was far away, hiding in the Loire Valley city of Chinon, surrounded by nobles, guarded by soldiers, and separated from Domremy by miles of dangerous, war-torn land. She was a teenage girl, unknown, untrained, uninvited. How could she possibly reach him? But Joan didn't hesitate. With the blessing of her voices, she travelled to the nearby town of Vaucouleurs, where a local commander named Robert de Baudricourt held influence. She told him what she had seen. She told him she was sent by God to save France. At first he laughed. A girl? Sent by God? To lead armies? But Joan was persistent. Day after day she returned to his doorstep. She wasn't arrogant. She was patient, firm, and unshakable in her purpose. People in the town began to notice her. They didn't see a mad girl. They saw someone with conviction. Eventually, Baudricourt agreed to help. In March of 1429, dressed in men's clothing for safety, Joan was given a horse, an escort of a few loyal guards, and a blessing for the road ahead. It was not a grand army, but it was a beginning. Her journey to Chinon began. The path was treacherous. English patrols roamed the countryside. Roads were muddy, bridges broken, villages burned. But Joan pressed forward. Day and night she rode. Through forests, across rivers, past silent fields where battles had once raged. She didn't look back. For most people, this journey would have been the end of the story, the brave attempt of a girl who tried. But for Joan, this was only the first step. She was not travelling to plead. She was travelling to claim her role. The voices had spoken. The vision was clear. And now, the girl from Domremy was on her way to meet a prince and to change the destiny of a nation. After 11 days of riding through enemy territory, Joan arrived at the royal stronghold in Chinon. The castle stood tall above the town, grand, imposing, filled with nobles and guards. Inside its stone walls, the man who claimed to be the rightful king of France waited. Charles, the Dauphin. But Charles was cautious. He had heard of Joan, the girl claiming divine guidance, but he wasn't convinced. He wanted proof. He wanted to test her. So he disguised himself. He stood in the crowd, dressed not as a prince, but as a simple courtier. Another man sat on the throne, pretending to be him. When Joan entered the hall, surrounded by curious onlookers, she didn't hesitate. She didn't look to the throne. She walked through the crowd, straight toward the real Charles, and bowed. The room fell silent. Charles was stunned. She had never seen him before. There were no portraits, no messengers. And yet, she knew him. She recognized him. She told him of her visions. She told him of the saints. She told him what God had revealed, that he was the true king of France, and that she had come to see him crowned. But Charles wasn't ready to believe so easily. He ordered theologians, bishops, and nobles to question her for days. They tested her faith, her knowledge, her intentions. Some tried to trap her with clever words, others waited for her to slip or contradict herself. She never did. She spoke plainly, humbly, with unwavering certainty. She was not there for glory. She asked for no reward. She only asked for an army, so she could lift the siege of Orléans and lead Charles to Reims for his coronation. It was a wild request, but over time the court began to shift. The more they listened, the more they believed. Not just because of what Joan said, but because of how she said it, with quiet confidence, with fire behind her eyes, with something that felt holy. And so, against all odds, Charles agreed. He would give her what she asked for, a sword, a banner, and command of troops. In that moment, Joan didn't just enter a castle, she stepped into history. The shepherd girl was now a general. Joan had passed the first test. She had found Charles and convinced him to listen. But that wasn't enough. Before any army would follow her, before any noble would dare ride beside her into battle, she had to prove herself. Not just to the king, but to the church. You see, this wasn't just a time of war. It was a time of deep religious fear. Heresy was punished with fire. Witchcraft was whispered about in every shadow. And here was a teenage girl claiming to speak directly with saints and asking for soldiers. Charles couldn't take that risk without certainty. So he sent her to Poitiers, where a panel of church officials, theologians, priests, scholars, would examine her. They questioned her for days, not about war, not about tactics, but about her soul. Who were these voices? What did they say? Why had they chosen her? They asked about her childhood, her prayers, her dreams. They studied her closely, looking for signs of pride, madness, or deception. They wanted to know if she had been led by heaven or something darker. Joan answered every question calmly. She spoke not like a preacher, but like someone who had lived what she believed. Her words were simple, but her faith was unshakable. She didn't boast. She didn't claim to know the future. She only said what had been revealed to her, and that she would obey the will of God, even if it cost her everything. One scholar asked her, "Do you believe you are in God's grace?" It was a trap. If she said yes, she would sound arrogant. If she said no, she would seem unworthy. But Joan simply replied, "If I am not, may God put me there. And if I am, may he keep me there." It was the perfect answer. One by one, the theologians fell silent, not because they were defeated, but because they were moved. In the end, they found no heresy, no lies, no pride, only faith. And with that, Joan was approved. A banner was made, a sword was sent for, and an army, though small at first, was placed under her command. She had passed the test, and now it was time for war. Joan was no longer just a village girl with visions. She had been tested by priests, questioned by scholars, observed by nobles, and she had stood firm through it all. Now she had what she needed: permission from the crown, trust from the church, and something she valued even more: a sense of purpose. The first mission was clear: lift the siege of Orléans. The English had surrounded the city for months. It was a vital stronghold, one of the last defences keeping France from falling entirely. Without it, the heart of the kingdom would be wide open. Many believed the city would fall. Supplies were dwindling. Spirits were broken. Even seasoned commanders had lost hope. But Joan had not. To her, this wasn't just a military mission. It was a holy command. She was given a suit of white armour, a war horse, and a small force of men. But what truly stood out wasn't her sword. It was her banner. Joan chose not to carry a weapon into battle. Instead, she carried a large white banner, painted with golden lilies and the image of Christ holding the world in his hands. At the top were the names Jesus and Mary. To Joan, the banner wasn't just a symbol. It was a promise. She believed it would guide her, protect her, and remind her men that they rode under divine will, not just royal orders. She prayed constantly. before each campaign, before every decision. She confessed often and encouraged her soldiers to do the same. She didn't allow swearing or mistreatment of women or looting. Her camp was disciplined, not with fear, but with faith. Many of the soldiers were skeptical at first. Some mocked her, others just didn't know what to think. But the more they watched her, the more they believed. There was something in her presence, something quiet but commanding. She spoke like someone who knew she was right. And even hardened fighters began to see her not as a strange girl, but as a leader. She wasn't there to be part of the war. She was there to change it. And with Orléans still under siege, her time to do so had finally arrived. It was the banner they followed. More than her armour, more than her title, more than her voice. It was that tall, fluttering banner held high in Joan's hands that drew soldiers to her side and hearts to her cause. White as a dove, stitched with golden lilies, the royal flower of France, and crowned with the names Jesus and Mary, it rippled like a flame in the wind. At its centre, an image of Christ sat in judgment, holding the world, a gentle reminder of who truly ruled over kings and kingdoms. Joan didn't ride at the back, safe behind lines. She rode at the front, always, and always with her banner. In every battle, it was the first thing soldiers saw when they turned toward the enemy. Not a sword, not a trumpet, but a piece of fabric, held with both hands, lifted into the sky like a prayer. Joan once said she loved her banner more than her sword. She believed it carried no blood. It only carried light. And that's what made her different. Other leaders fought for glory, for gold, for pride. But Joan fought for something far more difficult to explain. Something divine. She never claimed her victories were hers. She gave credit to heaven, to the voices, to the will of God. Still, those around her couldn't help but feel something powerful when she passed by, something that couldn't be measured by military rank. Veterans who had seen 100 battles suddenly felt hope again. Young boys who had only known fear stood taller. Even commanders, skeptical and proud, began to respect the girl in white. Because she wasn't asking them to fight for a throne. She was asking them to believe. And belief, as they would soon see, could be more dangerous than any blade. With her banner fluttering above her, Joan prepared for her first campaign, a march to Orléans, where one of the greatest sieges in French history still dragged on. She wasn't just carrying fabric into battle. She was carrying a symbol, a message, a holy command stitched in thread, and it would soon fly above a battlefield drenched in doubt and longing for a miracle. The city of Orléans had been under siege for nearly 7 months. Surrounded by English forces, the people inside were starving. Supplies were low. Morale was lower. The once great city, a vital stronghold on the Loire River, was on the verge of collapse. If Orléans fell, the path to the rest of France would lie open, and many believed the crown would fall with it. But then, word began to spread. A girl was coming, not a noble, not a knight, a girl, young, fierce, dressed in armour and carrying a white banner. The people whispered her name, Jeanne. Joan's arrival at Orléans in April of 1429 was more than just a moment. It was a shift in the wind. Soldiers lined the walls to catch a glimpse of her. Civilians peered from windows. Children ran beside her horse. The city, for the first time in months, stirred with hope. She was not a traditional commander. She didn't speak of strategy or revenge. She spoke of faith, of God's will, of the courage to act boldly even when fear was thick in the air. The English mocked her. They called her a witch, a peasant, a fool. But Joan didn't answer their insults with words. She answered with action. In the days that followed, she led charge after charge. She rode at the front, never hiding behind her troops. At one point, she was struck by an arrow and carried from the field. But she returned later that same day, bloodied but unbroken, leading her men once more with her banner held high. Her courage was not reckless, it was contagious. French soldiers who had once cowered behind walls now surged forward. Skirmishes turned to victories. The tide began to turn. And on May 8th, 1429, the unthinkable happened. The English, battered and demoralized, lifted the siege. Orléans was free. The bells rang out. People wept in the streets. They embraced one another as if waking from a long nightmare. And at the centre of it all was a teenage girl from a forgotten village, who had come not with a sword in hand, but with faith in her heart. Joan had done what no one thought possible. And yet, this was only the beginning. Victory at Orléans changed everything. It wasn't just a military success. It was a miracle. The French people had been drowning in despair, watching their lands disappear inch by inch, year after year. Then suddenly a teenage girl in white armour arrived and turned the tide. Joan had done what seasoned generals could not, and now people believed. Word of her victory spread like fire across the kingdom. Villagers spoke her name with reverence. Priests called her heaven sent. Soldiers, once sceptical, now clamoured to fight beside her. Even hardened commanders began to bow their heads when she passed. For France, this wasn't just the lifting of a siege. It was the lifting of fear. Something had shifted in the soul of the nation. For the first time in years, the French dared to think that perhaps, just perhaps, they could win this war. But Joan didn't pause to celebrate. She knew her mission wasn't over. The voices had been clear. She was to see the Dauphin crowned at Reims. And that was no small task. The traditional site for French coronations, Reims, lay deep in enemy-held territory. To get there, Joan and the French army would have to march through towns occupied by hostile forces, past English and Burgundian resistance, across bridges that might be burned and roads that could be blocked. Many in Charles's court hesitated. They advised delay, diplomacy, caution. But Joan stood firm. "The way is hard," she said, "but I was born for this." And the Dauphin, still uncertain, still weighed down by doubt, chose to trust her. Troops were gathered, supplies loaded. The plan was simple in spirit, but bold in action. March to Reims. Crown the king. Show the world that France still lived. Each victory they won along the way made the next one easier. Some towns surrendered without a fight. Others opened their gates joyfully. People welcomed Joan like a saint, laying flowers in her path. She wasn't just leading an army anymore. She was leading a movement, one powered by faith, fueled by courage, and destined for history. The war wasn't over. The dangers ahead were many. But the tide had turned, and Joan was riding it. She was barely 17. She had no noble title, no military training, no education beyond church sermons and the rhythm of the land. And yet, wherever Joan rode, men followed. Not because of her sword, but because of her eyes. They spoke of fire. There was something in her gaze, a calm intensity, a sense that she had already seen how things would unfold. She didn't promise ease. She didn't promise safety. But when she looked at you, you believed that something larger was moving through her, something unshakable. Joan didn't bark commands or rule through fear. She didn't need to. She led by example. She rose early, prayed often, treated everyone with the same dignity, whether they were a nobleman or a stable boy. She spoke plainly, and when she spoke of her mission, there was no wavering. Her faith wasn't loud. It was steady. Many men, older and hardened by war, began to change in her presence. They stopped swearing. They attended Mass. Some even confessed for the first time in years. It was as if Joan reminded them of who they used to be and what they could still become. She didn't try to impress. She didn't act superior, but the purity of her purpose made others feel both humbled and lifted. And when she rode into battle, she didn't raise a weapon. She raised her banner. That simple cloth, fluttering white against the chaos of war, became a symbol of something more than politics or land. It was a symbol of hope, and of heaven watching. One soldier said, "Wherever she went, it felt like the fear melted away." Another wrote, "It was not just that she was brave, it was that she made you braver." Even her enemies noticed. English captains cursed her name, calling her a witch, a demon, a trick of the devil. But their insults carried a thread of fear. They didn't understand her, and they couldn't seem to stop her, because she didn't move like someone trying to win a battle. She moved like someone fulfilling a prophecy. And behind those soft eyes, lit by quiet fire, was a storm they hadn't yet seen. The road to Reims stretched long and uncertain before them. Reims was more than a city. It was sacred ground, the place where French kings had been crowned for centuries. For Charles to be truly recognised as King of France, he had to be crowned there. Without it, his rule remained a question mark, a fragile claim in the shadow of English power. But the journey would not be easy. The route passed through territory still held by the enemy. English garrisons guarded key towns. Burgundian allies of the English held sway in others. Bridges could be destroyed. Roads could be blocked. There were no guarantees. And yet, the army moved forward. With Joan at its centre, the French forces pushed toward their goal. Word of their advance travelled faster than their horses. Town after town, the people watched as the white banner approached. Some had prepared to resist, but most opened their gates. In many places, no swords were drawn. The sight of Joan in armour, carrying her sacred banner, was enough to turn fear into surrender. She had become a symbol not just of military strength, but of divine favour. A walking declaration that France had not been abandoned by heaven. As they marched, the soldiers began to change. Doubts fell away. Confidence returned. What had once been a scattered, uncertain force was beginning to move as one. The landscape passed beneath their feet in quiet reverence. Fields scarred by war, churches left empty by fear, villages that had not known peace in years. Yet, with each mile, the distance between Charles and his destiny grew shorter. Joan's presence remained constant, calm, composed, and driven by something deeper than politics. She didn't seek comfort or recognition. Her eyes remained fixed on the horizon, where the spires of Reims would soon rise into view. Behind her rode the future of France. The march was not just a military campaign. It was a pilgrimage, to reclaim not only a crown, but a sense of hope, of identity, of something ancient and sacred that had been nearly lost. By the time they reached Reims, the gates did not close against them. The city opened its arms, and France held its breath. The march to Reims became more than a journey. It became a movement. As Joan and the French army pressed northward, towns that had once feared the English, or had sided with the Burgundians, began to rethink their loyalties. One by one, cities opened their gates, not with rebellion, not with bloodshed, but with quiet surrender and cautious hope. There was something in the air now, something changing. For years, the French people had been divided, by politics, by fear, by foreign rule. Entire regions had slipped into silence under English control, convinced that resistance was futile. But as the news spread that Joan was leading an army toward Reims, and winning, the silence began to crack. Towns that had once stood neutral now sent messengers. Some offered supplies, others offered soldiers. In many cases, they simply opened the doors and stepped aside. No force was needed. The banner was enough. It wasn't just the victories that inspired this. It was the pattern, the consistency. Every step Joan took seemed to rewrite the story of France, from one of decline to one of renewal. She became the thread that stitched the broken pieces back together. In city after city, villagers stood in the streets and watched her pass. She didn't wave. She didn't stop for celebration. Her purpose was too clear, too urgent. But her presence lingered behind her, like a blessing left in the air. The nobility took notice too. Lords who had once stayed silent now rode out to join the cause. Some did so out of faith, others out of strategy. But either way, the line of support behind Charles grew stronger with every league. The English, watching from a distance, could only hold their ground and wonder when, or if, the march would stop. Their confidence, once unshakable, began to falter. This wasn't a rebellion, it was a restoration. And Joan, with her steady pace, her silent armour, and her banner catching every whisper of wind, was not just changing the course of the war, she was reminding France what it meant to stand together. And soon, ahead on the horizon, the ancient towers of Rheims would come into view. At last the towers of Rheims rose into view, tall and silent against the sky, as if watching the army approach with cautious wonder. For centuries this city had crowned the kings of France. Its cathedral, sacred and vast, stood like a monument to tradition, memory, and divine right. But now, for the first time in years, the path to coronation was clear. The city did not resist. It did not hesitate. It welcomed Charles and his army. The people, though uncertain of the future, knew what this moment meant. It wasn't just about war or politics, it was about healing, about reclaiming something ancient, the soul of a wounded nation. Preparations began almost at once. Inside the great cathedral, torches lit the stone walls, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts from generations past. Priests gathered sacred oils, nobles arranged garments of state, trumpets were polished. Silence filled the spaces between movement, the kind of silence that comes before something sacred. And through it all, Joan remained quiet. She had brought him here. Her mission, at least this part, was nearly complete. She asked for no reward, no riches, no title. She stood in the background, armoured, dusty, and calm. On July 17th, 1429, Charles was crowned King of France. The Archbishop anointed him with holy oil, and as the crown was placed upon his head, a cheer rose through the cathedral and spilled out into the city like sunlight through stained glass. The people wept. They shouted his name. They knelt. For the first time in years, France had a king not just in name, but in ritual, in symbol, in spirit. At the side of the altar stood Joan, holding her banner. She had insisted it be present at the coronation, the same banner that had led her through battle, across burned fields and broken towns. To her it wasn't about the crown, it was about the purpose behind it. That day, history shifted. The Dauphin had become the king. France had taken a breath it hadn't drawn in years, and the girl from Domremy, once unknown, once doubted, had delivered a nation to its destiny. The bells of Rheims still echoed. The crown rested on Charles's head. The people called him king. But behind the celebration, something colder had begun to stir. Joan had delivered everything she promised. She had lifted the siege of Orléans. She had led a triumphant march across enemy territory. She had brought the Dauphin to Rheims and watched as he became a crowned monarch. Her banner had never fallen. Her courage had never faltered. But not all were grateful. In the polished halls of the royal court, whispers replaced cheers. Among nobles and advisers, unease began to grow. Joan was not one of them. She had no bloodline, no political ties, no interest in diplomacy or courtly games. She didn't speak in riddles or flatter with empty words. She told the truth. She spoke with fire, and she believed her mission came not from kings, but from heaven. That frightened people. To some, she was a miracle. To others, a disruption. Her presence made the powerful uncomfortable. Her fame outshone the men who had sat by in silence while France burned. Now, with Charles crowned, some believed her role was complete, that she should return to her village, disappear into history, and let the court reclaim control. But Joan had no intention of stopping. Her voices had not told her to rest. They had not released her from her mission. There was still work to do, land to reclaim, battles to fight, justice to restore. Yet Charles, newly crowned and cautious, began to hesitate. He no longer moved with the urgency he had when he was desperate. The court urged restraint. They spoke of alliances, truces, and the risks of pressing too far, too fast. Joan's call for continued action began to fall on quieter ears. She had stood with him in the cathedral. She had helped place the crown upon his head. And now, as politics returned to the throne room, she began to feel the chill of distance, not from enemies, but from those she had fought to serve. Joan's victories had changed the war, but they had also changed how the world saw her, and not everyone was ready for the kind of change she brought. The crown had been placed, the victory parades had passed, and the cathedral doors had long closed behind them. France had a king once more, but for Joan, something vital had begun to slip away. King Charles VII, once hesitant but reliant on her, now stood more distant. He had been a man in search of legitimacy, and Joan had delivered it. Yet now that his crown was secure, his need for her had changed. Where once he had listened intently to her visions and trusted her instincts in battle, now he turned to his counsellors, men of rank, of court, of calculation. They didn't speak her language. Joan spoke with certainty, with fire, with divine urgency. They spoke of treaties and time, of slow steps and careful hands. She moved as one called by God. They moved as those guarding power. And Charles, caught between them, began to drift away. Joan asked to continue the campaign. She urged him to strike while momentum was still theirs. Paris, the heart of France, remained under enemy control. She wanted to take it. She believed they could. But Charles delayed. He entered negotiations with the Burgundians. He signed treaties that promised little and delivered less. His court grew cautious, suspicious even, of Joan's influence, her popularity, her growing legend. She was no longer the mystery girl arriving in a burst of hope. She was now something harder to define, a force that didn't fit into royal plans. Charles stopped sending her reinforcements. He limited her authority. He listened when others questioned her voices, her intentions, her place in the order of things. Still, Joan pressed on. She led small campaigns. She liberated towns. She fought without the full strength she once commanded. Her belief never wavered, but her support did. And while the king rested behind palace walls, the girl who had carried his name across the battlefield found herself increasingly alone. Not abandoned, not yet, but no longer fully welcomed either. What Joan didn't know was that the greatest threat she would soon face wouldn't come from an enemy sword, but from a turning tide within the very nation she had given everything to save. The war had not ended with the coronation. While King Charles lingered in negotiations and political caution, Joan continued to fight. With a smaller force and waning support, she turned her attention north, to places where the English still held power, and where Burgundian allies of the enemy still threatened the heart of France. One such place was Compiègne. It was a strategic town, not large, but vital. In the spring of 1430, Joan moved to defend it. She knew its fall would strengthen enemy lines and weaken France's fragile gains. Her forces were few, but her determination remained intact. The fighting came swiftly. On May 23rd, Joan rode out with a small contingent to confront a Burgundian assault just outside the city walls. The battle was sudden and chaotic, more a skirmish than a siege. As the tide turned against her, she ordered a retreat, hoping to draw her soldiers back behind the safety of Compiègne's gates. But as they neared the drawbridge, the gates were closed. To this day, no one knows exactly why. Some say it was fear, that the guards panicked. Others whisper of betrayal, that someone had given the order to shut her out. Perhaps it was confusion, or perhaps it was fate. Joan was surrounded. She fought until she was pulled from her horse and dragged to the ground. She had faced swords before, stared down the fury of armies. But this moment was different. This time, there was no escape. She was captured by the Burgundians, French allies of the English. They didn't treat her as a noble prisoner of war. To them, she was more valuable as a symbol and as a bargaining chip. From the fields outside Compiègne, Joan was taken away in chains. Her armour was removed, her banner gone. The girl who had once led thousands now found herself in a dark cell, watched by guards, her future uncertain. And from the royal court, from the king she had crowned, there came no rescue. No army was sent, no gold offered, no message of defiance or support. France's saviour had been captured, and the silence from her own kingdom would soon become louder than the voices that once guided her. After her capture at Compiègne, Joan was taken into Burgundian custody, not as a soldier, not as a noble, but as a curiosity, a prize, and a threat. For months she was moved from one stronghold to another, kept under heavy guard, far from the battlefield and far from any friendly faces. Word of her imprisonment spread quickly. Across France, people waited to see what would happen next. Would the king demand her release? Would he offer ransom, as was customary for prisoners of her status? But no such offer came. King Charles, now secure on his throne, remained silent. Perhaps he feared the controversy she carried. Perhaps the politics of the court had shifted too far. Perhaps he believed there was nothing more she could do for him. Whatever the reason, he did not act, and so Joan remained alone. The Burgundians, meanwhile, saw an opportunity. Joan was too dangerous to release, too powerful a symbol to keep. But there was someone who would gladly take her, and pay handsomely for the chance. The English. To them, Joan was more than an enemy. She was an embarrassment, a peasant girl who had undone years of their campaign, who had made them look weak, who had inspired an army with nothing but faith and fire. They didn't want her silenced. They wanted her discredited. The transaction was quiet, but decisive. For 10,000 livres tournois, a large sum at the time, the Burgundians handed her over. She was transferred to the English, brought to the city of Rouen, their stronghold in occupied France. There they would put her on trial, not as a soldier, but as a heretic. By purchasing her, they had ensured full control of her fate. They wouldn't need swords to defeat her now. They would use robes, scrolls, and a courtroom. And as for Charles, the king she had risked everything to crown, he remained silent still. No letter, no rescue, no attempt. The girl who had once been called a miracle, a saint, a saviour of France, had been sold to her enemies. And soon they would begin tearing her apart, not with violence, but with words. In the cold halls of Rouen, behind thick stone walls and guarded towers, Joan of Arc was brought before her accusers. It was not a trial of justice. It was a trial of intent, planned not to uncover truth, but to destroy her credibility, her character, and the symbol she had become. The English didn't want to simply punish Joan. They wanted to erase her, to shatter the legend that had inspired a nation and humiliated their armies. But they couldn't execute her as a prisoner of war. That would only make her a martyr. They needed something darker, something more permanent. So, they turned to the church. Led by Bishop Pierre Cauchon, a man loyal to the English crown, the trial was dressed in religious language, but rotted from within. Its purpose was never to understand Joan's visions or judge her fairly. It was to convict her of heresy. She was interrogated dozens of times over the course of months, without legal counsel, without rest, and often without compassion. A panel of theologians, many of them hostile, examined her every word, hoping she would slip, contradict herself, or show signs of falsehood. But Joan did not. Though she was just 19, uneducated and alone, she answered clearly and firmly. Her words, recorded carefully by scribes, reveal a calm mind and an unwavering spirit. They asked her about her voices, who they were, what they said, why they chose her. They questioned her choice to wear male clothing, her decision to lead soldiers, her claim to divine purpose. She didn't try to impress. She didn't try to charm. She simply told the truth as she knew it. Her calmness frustrated them. Her intelligence surprised them. Her clarity frightened them. Because even chained, even alone, she still carried authority. The church court was meant to break her. But instead, it revealed something even more powerful. A young woman who would not lie to save her life. Behind the pomp of the trial and the authority of robes, her accusers scrambled for a way to silence her that would not make her a hero. But the truth was already out. The story was already written in the hearts of her people. Still, the sentence would come, and they would make her pay for her courage. Through endless questioning, under the weight of chains and the pressure of fear, Joan remained steady. She was not defiant in the way of a soldier boasting victory. She was quiet, composed, firm. Her strength was not loud. It was deep. She didn't argue. She didn't cry out. She answered when asked and sat silently when not. Her stillness unnerved her accusers more than anger ever could. The court had hoped for confusion. They found conviction. They had hoped for contradiction. They found clarity. She never wavered from her claim, that the voices she heard were sent by God, that St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret had guided her, that they told her to lift France from despair and lead Charles to his rightful crown. She did not speak of politics. She did not blame others. She only spoke of obedience, to a higher command, one that existed beyond the reach of thrones or tribunals. Her judges grew impatient. They circled her with questions, traps, and accusations. They demanded explanations for things she had no reason to explain. Why did she wear men's clothing? Because it protected her in prison, among male guards. Why did she follow voices? Because they had led her to truth. They accused her of sorcery, of pride, of stepping outside a woman's place. But Joan did not speak to defend herself. She spoke only to affirm what she believed. Each answer was like a stone dropped into a still pond, calm but heavy. The room grew tense with each session, not because Joan fought back, but because she did not bend. The judges, cloaked in authority, found themselves standing before a girl who had nothing, no allies, no freedom, no future, and yet possessed something they could not touch: faith. She did not ask for mercy. She did not plead for release. And as the days passed, it became clear to all in the room she could not be broken. But in a trial where the verdict had been whispered long before the questions began, truth was never the goal. The storm had already gathered, and Joan, alone, calm, and unwavering, stood quietly at its centre. The verdict had always been waiting. Despite Joan's composure, despite her honest testimony and unwavering faith, the outcome of the trial was never in doubt. The court had not gathered to find the truth. It had gathered to write an ending. They needed her condemned. Not for what she had done, but for what she represented. A symbol of hope the English could not control. A voice that had inspired too many, and a reminder that power could come from places the powerful did not expect. The charges were carefully chosen: heresy, witchcraft, cross-dressing, not crimes of violence or treason, but spiritual defiance, shaped to frighten the faithful. They claimed she had acted arrogantly by saying God spoke to her, that her voices were not divine, that her clothing, male armour, was unnatural and defiant of the Church's laws. They framed her visions as deception, her strength as rebellion, and so the sentence was announced: death by fire. She would be burned at the stake, not simply executed but erased. It was a punishment meant to humiliate, to terrify, to leave no relics behind. Ashes cannot be honoured. They cannot be raised into saints. Joan was told her fate. She was offered one last chance to recant, to deny her visions, to admit she had lied. At first, in a moment of fear and pressure, she signed a confession. She agreed to wear a dress. She said she would accept the church's judgment. But in the days that followed, she realized what they were doing. They weren't saving her soul. They were silencing her. She took it back. She stood again in the clothes she had worn into battle, the armor of her identity, her mission, her truth. She refused to lie about the voices that had guided her. She refused to betray what she believed was God's calling. And with that, the sentence was final. There would be no delay, no pardon, no appeal. The fire would be prepared. The crowd would gather. And Joan of Arc, the girl who heard saints, who lifted a nation, who crowned a king, would now face the flames of the very world she had fought to save. The morning of May 30th, 1431, was quiet in Rouen. But the silence did not last. Word spread quickly through the city. Joan of Arc was to be executed. The townspeople came in crowds, some out of curiosity, some in mourning, and others unable to look away from history unfolding. At the centre of the marketplace, the stake had already been raised. Piles of wood were stacked high. Guards stood watch, their eyes uneasy. Even among her enemies, there was discomfort. This wasn't a battlefield. It was something colder, final. Joan was led from her cell. She wore a simple dress. Her head had been shaved, her hands were bound, but she walked without resistance. No crying, no anger, only a stillness that unnerved those around her. She asked for a cross. A kind soul, a priest, quickly fashioned one from 2 pieces of wood and handed it to her. She held it tightly, pressing it to her chest as she was led up the platform. She asked for another to be held high so she could see it as the flames rose. Witnesses said she looked up at it as if it were the only thing that mattered. When the executioner lit the fire, the wind caught it quickly. The flames rose fast, climbing the wood like hungry hands. The smoke curled into the morning air. The heat began to swell around her, and through it all, Joan remained calm. She did not curse her judges. She did not scream for help. The crowd watched, stunned, as a 19-year-old girl met death with the same quiet courage she had carried into every battle. Her final word, spoken through smoke and rising fire, was Jesus. Some wept. Others could not bear to look. Even the executioner, hardened by duty, later confessed he had never felt such fear. Not of Joan, but of what had been done to her. When the fire was out, nothing was left but ashes. And yet from those ashes, something unshakable began to take root. Joan's body had been taken, but her story had just begun. The flames of Rouen had done their work. Her body was gone, her voice silenced. But the echo of Joan's life began to grow louder in the days that followed. What had once been rumour became reflection. What had been seen as myth was now remembered as truth. The people of France, many of whom had doubted her at first, now spoke her name with reverence. In the streets, her story passed from mouth to mouth, not as a cautionary tale, but as a cry of injustice. They remembered the young girl who had arrived with nothing but a banner and belief, and changed the course of a kingdom. Even her enemies felt it. The English, though they had condemned her, began to sense what they had truly done. They hadn't just executed a peasant girl. They had created a martyr. The church, uneasy with the trial's process, began to review the records. Whispers rose among scholars and bishops. Had this truly been justice, or something far more political? Had they silenced a heretic, or a holy woman? In the years that followed, France continued its climb from the edge of ruin. King Charles VII, the same man Joan had crowned, would rule for decades. His silence during her imprisonment was never forgotten. He owed his throne to her, and though he never spoke of her publicly in those final days, he lived forever in her shadow. But Joan's name did not disappear. Decades later, the church reopened her case. Witnesses were called, testimonies re-read. What was uncovered shocked many. False charges, biased judges, manipulated outcomes. In 1456, her name was officially cleared. Joan of Arc was declared innocent, her trial labelled unjust, her execution a tragic error. But history had already decided. The people had seen her truth long before any court had, and long after the fire had died, her light still shone, brighter, stronger, and beyond the reach of those who once tried to extinguish it. Joan had died as a prisoner, but she would live on as something far greater, a symbol of faith, courage, and the unbreakable strength of conviction. Joan of Arc's story did not end with her death. It grew stronger, more luminous with each passing year, transforming from a tale of martyrdom to a legend of enduring faith and courage. In 1920, nearly 5 centuries after her execution, the Catholic Church declared her a saint. The process that led to her canonization was long and thorough, but it was the culmination of a journey that began on the battlefield and ended at the altar. Her legacy, however, had never depended on the actions of the Church. It was woven into the fabric of French history, into the hearts of the people who had followed her, prayed for her, and wept for her. Joan had been a symbol of hope when all seemed lost, and that hope had never truly died. Through the years, her name became synonymous with courage in the face of oppression. Soldiers, saints, and leaders from all corners of the world looked to her example, not for military tactics, but for the conviction to stand firm in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. Her story transcended borders. Joan became not just a figure of French pride, but of universal inspiration. Her rise from humble beginnings to the forefront of a nation's destiny was proof that power doesn't always rest in thrones or armies. Sometimes it resides in the hearts of those who refuse to be silenced, who refuse to be anything less than who they were called to be. Over time, Joan's image evolved. In the early days after her death, she was remembered with sorrow, with reverence, as a tragic hero. But soon, the narrative shifted. She was no longer simply the girl who was burned at the stake, but the warrior who rose above the trials of her time, and became a beacon of light. Her canonization was a moment of reflection, not just for the Church, but for the world. Joan had not only saved France, she had saved the hearts of those who believed in the impossible. And in doing so, she became an eternal symbol of divine strength and resilience. Joan of Arc's legacy was not just a national treasure, it was a global one, a reminder that sometimes the bravest among us are the ones who stand alone.